Welcome to episode 12 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, author of On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start with today's episode, let me remind you of our 3 ground rules. 1. Our focus is on classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, not on how modern commentators interpret it today. Number 2, our approach is not Neo-Epicurean, but Epicurean, and we aren't going to try to sell you Stoicism, Humanism, Buddhism, or Marxism. Epicurus was unique, and we aren't going to put him in a box of conventional modern morality. Number 3, we don't approach Epicurus as either a minimalist or as a hedonist or an atheist, as those terms are commonly used. We're going to study Epicurean philosophy exactly as Lucretius taught it, and that means that feeling, pleasure, and pain are the guides that nature gave us to live by, not gods, not idealism, and not virtue ethics. And it also means that the supernatural does not exist. That means there's no life after death, and any happiness we'll ever have comes in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. In episode 12, we'll continue our discussion of the void and introduce the issue of the properties and qualities of material things and what that means for issues such as time and for existence and non-existence. We'll be discussing this over several episodes, and we hope you'll join us as we continue through Book 1. Now let's get started with today's episode, with Charles reading the first part of today's text, followed by Elaine with the second part.
I could by many arguments confirm the system of a void, and fix your faith to what I say. But these small tracts I have drawn to such a searching mind will be enough. The rest you may find out without a guide, for as staunch hounds, once put upon the foot, will be nose soon rouse the mountain game from their thick covers. So you, in things like these, will be one thing by another trace, will hunt for the truth in every dark recess, and draw her thence. But if you doubt, or in the least object to what I say, I freely promise this, my Memmius. My tuneful tongue shall, from the mighty store that fills my heart, pour out such plenteous draughts from the deep springs, that tardy age, I fear, will first creep through my limbs, and quite break down the gates of life, before I can explain in verse the many arguments that give a light to one particular. But now I shall go on to finish regularly what I begun. All nature, therefore, in itself considered, is one of these, is body or is space, in which all things are placed and from which the various motions of all beings spring. That there is body, common sense will show. This as a fundamental truth must be allowed, or there is nothing we can fix as certain in our pursuit of hidden things, by which to find the truth or prove when 'tis found. Then, if there were no place or space, we call it void. Bodies would have nowhere to be, nor could they move at all, as we fully proved to you before.
Thank you, Charles. And so, Elaine, if you could read the next part.
Okay. Besides, there is nothing you can strictly say, it is neither body nor void, which you may call a third degree of things distinct from these. For every being must in quantity be more or less, and if it can be touched, though ne'er so small or light, it must be body, and so esteemed. But if it can't be touched, and has not in itself a power to stop the course of other bodies as they pass, this is the void we call an empty space. Again, whatever is must either act itself, or be by other agents acted on, or must be something in which other bodies must have a place and move. But nothing without body can act or be acted on, and where can this be done but in a vacuum or empty space? Therefore, beside what body is or space, no third degree in nature can be found, nothing that can ever affect our sense, or by the power of thought can be conceived. All other things you'll find essential conjuncts, or else the events or accidents of these. I call essential conjunct what's so joined to a thing that it cannot, without fatal violence, be forced or parted from it, is weight to stones, to fire heat, moisture to the sea, touch to all bodies, and not to be touched, essential is to void. But on the contrary, bondage, liberty, riches, poverty, war, concord, or the like, which not affect the nature of the thing, but when they come or go, the thing remains entire, these, as it is fit we call events. Time likewise of itself is nothing. Our sense collects from things themselves what has been done long since, the thing that present is and what's to come. For no one, we must own, ever thought of time distinct from things in motion or at rest. For when the poets sing of Helen's rape, or of the Trojan state subdued by war, we must not say that these things do exist now in themselves, since time, irrevocably past, has long since swept away that race of men that were the cause of those events. For every act is either properly the event of things, or of the place where those things are done. Further, if things were not of matter formed, were there no place or space where things might act, the fire that burned in Paris's heart, blown up by love of Helen's beauty, had never raised the famous contests of a cruel war, nor had the wooden horse set Troy on fire, discharging from his belly in the night the armed Greeks. From whence you plainly see that actions do not of themselves subsist, as bodies do, nor are in nature such as is a void, but rather are more justly called the events of body and of space, where things are carried on.
Okay, thanks, Elaine.
Generally, I don't find this translation as hard to read, but it just, as a side note, really interests me that what we are used to seeing, the phrasing of things, has really changed.
What's
a lot
emphasized
over
is
time.
very different.
The grammar,
Yes.
everything
Right.
is different, and it's more striking for some reason in these verses than previously. I'm not sure why.
This last part that Elaine read is particularly difficult, I think. And there's issues in it, not only in the phrasing you were just talking about, but one of the things I want to talk about today is the choice of words, because one of the reasons I like this particular translation is that he uses the word events, which is closer to the Latin eventum that is used. But virtually everybody else chooses to use the word accident, which to me has a different connotation and something we'll talk about. And I'm doing what I did not want to do, which is talk about this section first, because if we talk about this section now, we'll never go back to the first section. Let's first talk about what Charles read from 401 to 431, I think. That's kind of a continuation from last week, but let's see what there is in there, if anything, that we want to talk about. Again, one of the things about it, this is the reference to the fact that now you know, just given the information about matter and void, enough to basically uncover all the rest of everything. And he uses the analogy of the hound using the scent of game to find it. He said, basically, you've got the scent now, and one thing by another, you can trace out for yourself every dark recess and draw it out. So he's saying that we've got a really important part already done. Go ahead, Elaine.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's obvious that this is kind of the emphatic, like, I've really nailed it now. You know, there's just nothing you can say that can overcome what I've told you. And if you think there is, just let me have it, because I could just keep going endlessly until I'm dead.
Yes.
There's no end to the arguments for reality that can be made. But I also think what you just mentioned about once you've got it, you can see it for yourself. That applies to the whole of Epicurean philosophy. And where I see errors in Neo-Epicurean perspectives is that they never got this to begin with. And so then everything else they say, they're losing the train of it somehow as they move from the physics to the ethics. Something happens where they're losing their grasp on it. But if you ever really get it clearly, it's like those pictures where, you have the vase or the woman's face. So once you've seen those two, it's not going to be confusing to you anymore. The same way with this philosophy, if you really get a full handle on it, it will reward you and that you will see where people are making mistakes, not just about the philosophy, but in thinking about life, which really is philosophy. You'll, even if they're not Epicureans, you'll see, oh, this is where they're going wrong. So it's definitely worth our listeners' time to persist in this and really get convinced of the fundamentals, and then the rest is easy.
Can you expand on what you just said? I'm not sure I follow how the Neo-Epicureans, what part of this do you think they're not getting, and how does that, I guess, lead them to some other conclusion? I'm not sure I follow what you were saying there.
Well, so I think there are many examples, but one example would be how they can wind up thinking that there is an ideal social system that every individual should endorse. So if you start with the physics and start with matter and void, and you realize that there's no possibility of an absolute perspective, and that we apprehend objective reality through our senses. We apprehend reality subjectively, that we don't have any other way to apprehend reality, and that feelings are also part of this. If you keep that firmly in mind, you're not going to arrive at an idealist recommendation to people that they should always have one viewpoint or another. It would be silly. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
I think that's an excellent explanation. I couldn't have approached saying it better myself. And I think you're right that there's many examples. One thing that comes to my mind in the context is later on, I think it's in book 4, when Lucretius is talking about the relationship between reason and the senses. He uses the example of building a building like an architect. If you don't get the foundation right, then the building is eventually going to collapse because the foundation was never laid properly. And in many ways, the philosophy is like building a building or building any kind of a structure that relies on its foundation. You have to start at the beginning and have the foundation correct, and then make everything else consistent with the foundation, or else you're just going to be lost and it's eventually going to collapse. DeWitt talks about it, I think, in the sense of chain reasoning. He likes to talk about that many of Epicurus' arguments are a chain, that you make one observation, you add another observation, you add something else, and you're always referring back to your initial observations. And you can never allow there to be a contradiction and to forget your first observation. We're talking about contradictions last week, but this is where it really comes into play.
Polyvalent logic. Yeah, I've heard of it. I'd have to look up exactly where I heard that in the context of Epicurean philosophy, but it kind of struck me out because I hadn't really noticed it anywhere else except DeWitt. But I do want to touch up on the concept of Neo-Epicurean. I would say, just from owning the Discord, all these people who had joined, browsing the subreddit, and just generally finding a lot of places online and people who would identify as Epicureans. The vast, overwhelming amount, I'd say probably close to like 98% of anybody who's we could say is Neo-Epicurean, they focus exclusively on the ethics.
Right.
There is no physics, there is no canon of truth, no epistemology.
Yep. And if you lose those, you'll get into weird things with your ethics, right?
Yes. I forget, it's either Philebus or on ends. But without the physics, this is very, very much like what you said, Elaine. Basically, because they do not understand the foundation of physics in regards to Epicurean philosophy, they get lost or confused or whatever on how pleasure is viewed. It's always viewed as some, I don't know, for them it opens up the door of simple pleasures, ideal pleasures.
Yes.
Yes.
I've never heard or even seen anywhere a Neo-Epicurean talking about even the swerve, a concept that I think would be kind of pronounced among that crowd.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I don't know how to get them to see it other than if we persistently come back to the physics and proceed from there.
Yeah,
That's one of the reasons we're doing this one.
And I like to connect Epicurean philosophy to a lot of key terms or just terms found in philosophy to make it more approachable. But if a person wants to understand this, they have to take it upon themselves to see the truth, as Lucretius just wrote to Memmius.
I mentioned to several of you that I was really pleased with the results of last week's episode and how I really thought it would be very helpful for anybody to listen to that, no matter how much they knew about Epicurus or Lucretius, that it was a really good grounding in what Epicurean philosophy is really probably all about. But at the same time, I think I also acknowledged to myself that you were using the figure 98%, Charles. I acknowledged probably 98% of the people who listened to that episode would say to themselves, what are you guys talking about? Epicurus is all about pleasure and pain and ethics, and you have spent an hour thinking that he's talking about something besides those things, and they just wouldn't even relate to it. But you have to do this. You have to understand the basic orientation towards the universe before you can consistently apply the rest of it, or even before you can consistently understand the rest of it. I'm not even going in the direction of whether you agree or disagree with Epicurus. You don't even understand Epicurus if you don't understand first that most of what he's talking about is about an orientation towards the universe at large, and only then does he derive the issue of pleasure and pain and how to live. But he starts at what he considers to be the basics, which is the physics and, if you want to call it, epistemology, the way you look at the physics. Martin.
Yes, I'm listening.
Okay, anything to add on this point so far?
No.
I would like to just kind of briefly touch up. I wish I could get this in numbers, but we all know that one section to the letter of Minucius, the one that gets cited all the time. It's about a paragraph long. I don't think it's expounded that well in the Cyril Bailey translation that we have on site, but it's the one where it says, by pleasure we mean...
Yes.
Yeah. For some people, that is the most lengthy, comprehensive explanation of Epicurean philosophy.
It's all that matters to them. That paragraph is all that matters to them, Charles.
I've never understood the obsession with that paragraph.
Because it leads you towards simplicity, and it leads you towards sort of an idealistic statement of what ultimate pleasure should be. But go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Charles. You go ahead.
Well, hold on. I got to look up another translation.
So, based on a conversation I'm having with someone who is definitely not an Epicurean, that would consider more towards Platonist, but who's willing to discuss these things, I'm noticing that when you are like Epicurus, believing that it's important to study nature to find out how things are, of what the nature of things is, you're going to take a bottom-up approach. You're not going to accept conclusions that are abstract, that don't agree with the bottom-up construction of reality, right?
Yeah.
But there are the top-down people who really think that it's more important what the abstract ideas tell us to do and how they should form our decision-making than it is the bottom-up, not realizing that these abstract ideas came from our brains. It doesn't mean that they're accurate, and if they're not in accord with the bottom-up view, they're not really of any use. And certainly we shouldn't let our decisions be guided top-down by these abstract things that we've happened to have come up with. But we should start at the beginning and remember how things really work when we're making decisions.
Yes, Elaine, my perspective on that is absolutely what you just said. The conclusions not only come from the foundation, I would emphasize this point. You cannot understand the conclusions unless you understand the foundation, because the paragraph that Charles is referring to, which we probably could spend the rest of the episode talking about if we allowed ourselves to, and we should not do that today. But that paragraph, in my position, is totally reconcilable with the physics and the epistemology and the things that we're going through in the basics of Lucretius and what Epicurus wrote in the letter to Herodotus. But if you do not understand where he's coming from about everything being judged by the senses, then you can take that paragraph and look at the abstractions of it and come up with what I think is a totally different and contradictory conclusion against the fundamentals. And so when we get to that paragraph where we choose to spend an episode or however we get to it, that's my answer to what that paragraph means, is that it is clearly stated and it is totally consistent with Epicurean philosophy as written, but it has to be understood in the context of the fundamentals, in which you're just not going to reach these conclusions about an idealistic or an overly simplistic view of pleasure that people want to read into that because of their own pre-existing dispositions, which are not in any way based on the Epicurean fundamentals. So that's my direction of where that goes. Anybody else?
Yeah. So even for people who are new to Epicurus or don't know much about him, it will always be important to note and distinct that he was sort of a heterodox to the Hellenistic era. He went away from Aristotle. He went away from Plato.
He was a rebel. And surely everybody knows what heterodox means, but he's a rebel. Go ahead.
And he was kind of outside that the famous dialectical method of Greece at the time, as well as the sophistry of Athens and all that stuff. He has to be understood sort of without the other influence of the Greeks, except for besides Plato. But that's because so much of Epicurean philosophy is a refutation against Platonism.
Yes.
So it wouldn't make sense for anybody to group Epicurus in, even with Roman philosophers or anybody else for that matter. It's one of those schools where you have to understand it for its own merits. You have to read the source material and understand the foundation. That's just what I wanted to add in.
Okay. Anybody else right now?
Yeah, I want to add in. Okay, so I will admit that when I first started studying Epicurean philosophy, I was one of those people who only cared about the ethics, right? And it was Cassius that helped me see that the physics was important. But I want to say, on behalf of everyone who tends to focus more on the ethics, is that I think it's just, part of our society today and the way that we work, that we kind of compartmentalize everything. And if you read through the physics, there's just this tendency to go, yeah, duh, it's like whatever. And it's hard to make that connection. And that's why I asked Elaine to elaborate, because it's hard to make that connection between the physics and some of the things that you end up thinking about in terms of the ethics, because it's just not in our nature these days to connect them back. It's just very common, I think, for people to be science-based and yet then have these other beliefs that are no way supported by their science, but they just have a tendency to not even make that connection. So I think that's excellent that we covered that. And I think that's one of the things that we can do with this podcast is to draw those connections, just because it's not an easy connection to make, I don't think.
I think that's absolutely right. And I couldn't have said that better myself. And I had a similar reaction to you in that, I grew up, my dad was a physicist. My mother was a mathematician. I grew up with scientists. And so I also thought, duh. I was making the connection between physics and ethics, and I thought, why wouldn't anybody do that? And then the more I started observing how people spoke, I thought, they're not doing that. They're exactly as you say, they're compartmentalizing it. I just never imagined that anybody would do that. It didn't cross my mind that was possible, but now I see it. So now I understand why it is so important to hammer on the physics where I didn't before. And so I have Cassius to thank for that.
And I think I still do it, every now and then I catch myself and go, I'm not making this connection. So if I say something, please correct me.
Same here.
People are used to compartmentalizing, I think, for so many different reasons, but one of them, if you've got a religious background, how can you not compartmentalize? Because the absurdities and the ridiculous things that are taught in religion, when you go in on Sunday and listen to the preacher talk, you pretty much have to just wash that out of your mind in order to survive and live in the real world, because it is so ridiculous and so absurd. And people are used to just taking ethics and not worrying about where it comes from. And they pick and choose from sources that are totally contradictory with each other. But that's not what Epicurus is doing.
No, it's not. And I want to make another point about that, since you mentioned that, how they have to do that in religions. That was I think it was Stephen Jay Gould, correct me if I'm wrong, who talked about the two magisteria. Was he the one? I may have that wrong, but that's what comes to my mind. But the idea that there is the realm of science and fact, and then this other realm of religion, which is almost more like art. But the problem is, this is where people who are progressive Christians or of other religions will get into trouble, because they say, well, it's metaphor and we're using it symbolically, and we can still do that. The problem is that they forget what they're doing, and they take their abstractions as if they're accurate, even though the abstractions they arrived at are not grounded in reality. And so they're guided by these things like to love every person instead of the sensible thing, if you look at reality from the ground up, which is people are different from each other. And so use your brain and treat people differently according to how they act and whether they're causing you pain or not. So they're guided by these overarching abstract principles that they will argue are as real, but they're in a different magisterium than the magisterium of science. But you can't really do that and make good decisions about life that will lead you to pleasure.
Martin?
I mean, the separation between physics and ethics, this is very widespread, and this was actually a result of the conflict which arose at the time of Galileo between Christianism and the upcoming scientists. So, and the way to get out of this was to separate it like this.
Yeah.
So this was something that developed over time. And,
right. I just meant his phrase. I think he was the one that coined that phrase. But yes, I agree with you. It well preceded him, but he just used that word to describe it.
It was essentially a compromise so that both sides could go ahead. So
right.
Otherwise, with all the evidence coming up, the consequence would have been a complete refutation of Christianism.
Yeah.
I was going to say, since we're still kind of on topic of foundations and physics, we still have a few more sections to go, including the section of the letter to Herodotus.
Yes, we sure do have a lot more to go to, but we don't necessarily have to do it today. So if somebody has things they think are important, we can continue, because these other parts that follow are going to take a long time to discuss. So we may not have any choice but break it up. So anybody?
Yeah, one more thing I would say is that for listeners who are still clinging to either religious beliefs or abstract kinds of things like humanism with these abstract ideals that are not grounded in science, it's going to be hard for you to get the rest of it if you hang on to that. So it's real important. Is Lucretius convincing you of how reality works? Do you see any room in there for truly an abstract ideal? Or will you at least try out this possibility that reality is working as Lucretius says? If you at least try on that position, it'll be so much easier to see how the rest of it works in both in Epicurean philosophy and in your life. So this is not going to be a philosophy that's compatible with hanging on to any of those abstract notions, those ideals.
I would also like to add to that. I think that with a lot of the religions, there's a certain benefit that people see and they want to believe it, and so that's part of the pull. And I think that for Epicurean philosophy, it takes a lot more time and effort to see the benefit of the philosophy. And so I think in addition to us making these connections, which I think are important, I think as we go through, and I think we've been pretty good about this too, is to pull in some of the ethical concepts if they relate to what we're talking about, because that can help listeners start to understand the philosophy better, because I do think it takes a little bit more time than the promise of some religions,
Good. Yeah. And so you mean maybe reminding them that if they really understand this, that they will be able to make decisions that will lead them to a much more pleasurable life.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. The rewards are great.
Okay. In the same context, then, I want to use a few different words to describe probably this point that I made earlier, which is And Elaine's talking to the people and encouraging them to give the philosophy a chance and to realize that it can produce great benefits if you do give it a chance and apply it consistently. The point I would add to that is, in order to even really give it a chance or apply it consistently, you have to understand it. And you are going to confront interpretations of Epicurus that are different from each other. You're going to find people who want to focus exclusively on the ethics and who drill down to a passage in the letter to Menicius and come to the conclusion that Epicurus is all about absence of pain. And once you understand absence of pain, that's all you need to know about Epicurus. And I just want to emphasize that I don't think that's the case at all. You can take that passage that people always point to and come up with different ways of looking at it and understanding what it means. And the only way to really be fair to Epicurus and to understand what Epicurus meant is to go back into his fundamental presumptions and start, like he did, building from the ground up until you get to that point. And what I would contend, and I think DeWitt and there are many other authorities that we can point to, would contend, is that if you do build from the ground up, when you get to that passage in the letter to Menicius, you will not conclude that the best life is eating bread and water and living in a cave. But you have to be ready to confront that controversy and evaluate it based on what Epicurus has taught about the nature of the universe and not what you understand having been brought up your whole life in church or in college or in a university philosophy class taught by professors who virtually all think that Epicurus is absurd.
Yeah, right.
And for anybody who has read that section from the letter to Menicius who are unfamiliar with Epicurus, a good way to understand when a person has kind of reduced the philosophy is to see how they fumble when it comes to reconciling this very simplistic and ascetic interpretation where pleasure is absence of pain and just reasoning and simple pleasures. But when in that same interpretation they talk about other concepts or about recognizing pleasure as good, almost always they sort of fumble. You know, things won't always line up.
It to me it's almost like they think there are two feelings, pain and void.
It's a great point.
And that when you're feeling what we would all call pleasure, you're just getting fooled. That's really pain. What you really want is void.
Well, I have seen a lot of people who have written about Epicurus, and they only quote that section of Menicius and like maybe the other letters.
Yeah.
They think that in that removing desire and thus achieving pleasure through what they call the absence of pain, they have achieved ataraxia. Yeah. Because the concept is so similar to a lot of Platonic idealisms. Of course, it's escaping my mind right now, but it's a very familiar concept.
And so also because of the Western fascination with Buddhism and the idea of removing desire, and desire is bad and leads to trouble.
There is also an idyllic fascination with tranquility or like cathartic states of being, which is why the whole tranquillism and ataraxia always gets so tossed in with the word blessedness.
Yeah. You know, I have thought, and this may be a little bit off topic, but it's still related to our subject, that this kind of dream that what we want is this idle state, that's the ultimate goal. I saw a study recently. I'll try to find it. I don't think it's a real new one, but what people think what they really want to do is just have free time and not do anything. You know, I want to go on vacation and lay on the beach. I don't want to do anything. But when they're given in experimental conditions, they're put somewhere where they have nothing to do, which is what they think they want. If they're given the flimsiest excuse to go run even some trivial errand versus continuing to sit there, in reality, they'll choose to go run the trivial errand. They don't, you know, it's boring just to sit there. But when you're doing something maybe that you don't want to do, humans will sometimes make the mistake of thinking, oh, what I really want is to do nothing. When in reality, what they want to do is something pleasant instead of something unpleasant. So I think this kind of weird way our brains sometimes work, we can fall under that illusion. And then when we read things we read about the Buddhist literature about this desireless state and this total pure peacefulness where you're doing nothing, you're just existing. It sounds like something we might want, but in reality, it isn't. That's one of those abstract states that doesn't really exist. And that's why for most people, prolonged meditation is boring. It's not pleasant.
I don't think being a hermit in a cave with bread and water, thinking about pleasure would be very pleasant.
Right. Boring, right? Are we going to have time to go over these last ones, or should we save that for next time? Because there's so much in these last.
Yes, we'll go into that next week, because the points we've been talking about in the last few minutes are so important and so critical and of such interest to so many people. I think we need to use the rest of the time today to just finish up this particular topic, because I want to go back and say the same thing again in a different way. There's nothing wrong with that passage. It can totally be read in a way that is totally consistent with everything we've been talking about. I'm not suggesting that any of it is mistranslated or that any of it has been garbled. If you take it within the context of the full philosophy, it can make perfect sense. You won't go down the rabbit hole that people who are not interested in the physics will follow it down, because you just won't ever see it in that same way. I think about the DeWitt book, and he touches on this a little bit, but he doesn't really dwell on it, which is one of the things that I think makes the DeWitt book so valuable. He certainly does not leap to that part as the most important thing about Epicurus. He takes it at its proper time when he's discussing the ethics and the letter to Menicius. I just don't think that he thought it was worth the time to devote a long, extensive passage to why absence of pain is not the full message of Epicurean philosophy, because you're just not going to ever be tempted by that. If you start with the basics, that nothing exists eternally but atoms and void, which means there's no heaven, there's no hell, there's no supernatural God, there's no realm of idealism and archetypes like Plato would suggest. And how could you ever, once you really understand that, and you know that there's really no ultimate reward other than the way you live your life in the here and now, you're just not going to be as tempted by this abstraction that can only be of benefit to you in your mind or in a future world or a future life. And those things aren't just going to me, I don't believe a person who understands Epicurean perspectives on the nature of the universe is going to be tempted by that.
Yeah, so maybe for readers who are maybe a little bit on the fence about this, maybe some of this is new, maybe a good thing is just to start noticing when somebody's trying to do this to magisteria thing. Notice when you're doing it, notice when somebody else is doing it. That might actually be easier. And consider that those might be ideas that are susceptible to reality testing.
Right. You know, I've heard this argument expressed in another way as well. Does anybody want to tackle the common statement that there is no way to derive an ought from an is?
Yeah, you can't do it unless you use feelings. And that is where they're forgetting. So because we are Epicurean, we know that our feelings, which of course come from interactions of matter, you know, the molecules in our brain and so on, but they are real events, our feelings. Well, we hadn't got to the events yet, but that's going to happen. But they're part of reality. And so that is where we get our ought. It's what we want. It's what we desire, what's pleasurable, especially using wisdom to choose actions that are going to result in more pleasure than pain. And that is the only way that you can get an ought. You cannot get it if you exclude feelings.
And of course, Epicurus puts feelings in the center of the canon of truth from his perspective, that the feelings of pleasure and pain are equal with the senses and with what he calls the anticipations.
Right. There's no way you can just look at events minus feelings and have an ethics that makes any sense at all. You have your feelings are your basis for ethics.
And that comes at a shock to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Especially in Western thought, we're also used to the idea that we need to beat down our feelings or suppress them because they get in the way or they're not reliable.
Yes, you can't trust them. They're primitive. We need to have abstract principles to guide us because we're still paleo people. is one of the arguments that I hear.
I believe we are about to accomplish another episode that is going to make our record books as one of our best, along with last week's. This one is going to be one of the best for newer people or people who are not familiar with Lucretius or Epicurus to listen to. But let's make closing comments from here. Charles.
Well, I'm very much interested in taking critiques as well as misinterpretations, especially Neo-Epicurean perspectives of the philosophy, and kind of explaining them and then turning them on their heads. I think that will kind of be more important in the future if we have a lot of people coming to the forums or the Facebook site as a result, or if we see some huge growth in people joining. But I also wanted to say that I've had some writer's block for like the past 3 weeks, but there's one thing I want to at least kind of formulate. It was a criticism that I saw in Will Durant, as well as countless of those articles online.
Charles, what is the criticism in summary?
That Epicurean philosophy is seen as extremely individualistic, so how can it possibly be adapted over a huge population? Or how could there be an Epicurean state? Or what would an Epicurean society actually look like?
Charles, you're right. That may be too huge an issue to cover. But I want to say this about that. I think all of us have strong opinions about what we personally think is the best way to live, and even what we think is more preferable in terms of societies. But one of the reasons that we don't spend a lot of time talking about that, at least in the way we're going into things right now, is that unless you understand the philosophy, you end up just giving your own personal opinion and not grounding it to Epicurus at all. And what I think is probably the first step that would have to be taken before you could start talking about sociology or politics in an intelligent way is to first make sure you understand what Epicurus said in the first place, and that you're applying Epicurean philosophy and not just some personal preference or humanism or Marxism or whatever your other predisposition is, which is, I think, what a lot of people are doing. So again, I think Epicurean philosophy has profound implications on society and politics. You can't read the last 10 doctrines on justice without realizing that Epicurus has huge implications for how people relate to each other in a society. But if the foundation's not there, then you're not going to draw good conclusions about some of the more difficult issues like society and politics. And I think we have to start somewhere, which is getting the foundation in line before we go off and embrace very difficult and very emotional issues that drive people away before they even begin to understand what Epicurus is about. Having said that, go ahead, Ed, or anybody else comment on that.
I agree. And I guess my wrap up would be this one phrase, that the rest you may find out without a guide, that listeners can be sure that if they take the time to really understand how this works, it gets easy, and that it helps you, practically speaking, to have a more pleasurable life.
Charles, I didn't mean to cut you off if you had more to say either.
No, it's a good point to always stay focused on the source material. And because there's not a whole lot written on the subject, it's very loose territory that could be easily misinterpreted into adopting, like you said, Marxism, humanism, something else. So yeah, it's a very valid concern, but it's one that I've seen, especially from the Stoics, who I've conversed with online.
Other closing comments from Julie or Martin?
I have one, but it's switching back to an earlier topic. I feel like we've kind of picked on the letter to Menicius a little bit today. And
Yes.
So let me defend it, because I love the letter to Menicius. And I would like to point out that the particular paragraph that we're talking about, the last sentence or two in that paragraph, really kind of circles back beautifully to what we said today, and that those last sentences are: instead, life is made pleasant by sober contemplation and by close examination of the reasons for all decisions we make as to what we choose and to what we avoid. And I think that if you take that to mean what we've been talking about, in that every time you make a decision about what you're going to do or not do, you link that back to the physics, then you'll be consistent in your philosophy.
Great.
Yeah,
point.
there's a point, just a little sentence I wanted to say. I didn't quite have the right time. But it's not the letter to Minucius that is incorrect. It's that interpretation that is so contrived to say Epicurus was like a minimalist sage. It's that interpretation that doesn't take anything else into account. That's already filled with whoever is citing the letter to Minucius's personal opinions or their own preconceived notions. So it's not the letter to Minucius that's wrong.
Right. That's a really important point. Yeah, I'm glad y'all said that, because I like it also. So we're not criticizing the letter.
And
Right.
a good way to illustrate that is to compare it to Epicurus's biography by Diogenes Laertius. A lot of the stuff found in there isn't consistent with what people who cite the letter to Minucius with that very minimalist pleasure is the absence of pain approach. Reading the biography of Epicurus it doesn't line up. They're not consistent.
That's a good point, Charles. The physics in Lucretius and the letter to Herodotus are really essential and important foundations, but a lot of the inconsistency with that interpretation you're talking about could be picked up if you just read the full biography from Diogenes Laertius and read everything he said about how Epicurus endorsed both pleasures of rest and pleasures of action.
Mm-hmm. As well as not being able to recognize good without his sensations.
Right. Foolish consistency may be the hobgoblin of little minds, but you have to be consistent and go back to the foundations if you can understand what Epicurus was talking about.
Right. Well, so how I take that quote is, to me, should be applied to these abstract ideas, right? That foolish consistency in saying that truth is always a virtue and it has to be the right thing because it's this abstract ideal. No, not always. You know, there are exceptions to when telling the truth would be against pleasure. So let's be consistent with our physics and with our goal of pleasure, but let's don't be consistent with just using tools religiously as if the tool is the thing.
Right. When I first used the quote, I had to look it up because it's tempting to collapse it down and think that the quote is consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, but it's not. It is foolish consistency.
Right. And I think Epicurus would have liked that quote.
Right. Martin.
I have nothing to add.
I can't wait to listen to this episode again. I feel like if I listen to it again, there's going to be other gems that I'm going to pick up myself.
This one's going to edit down very well. The last one from last week turned out really well, and this one is going to be just as good, if not better. So I really, really appreciate everybody's contribution to this. It's something that I've wanted to do for years, and I think it really moves us to a new level of communication of some of these ideas.
I think we're all starting to be a bit more comfortable with the format and when to speak, what to add.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, anything else before we close for today?
I don't think so.
We've had closing thoughts for the last half hour.
That's a good point. I guess my closing thought will just be personal to you all, and maybe this will be interesting for historical reasons, but, you know, we're in the midst of the ramping up of the novel coronavirus pandemic, and I will be thinking about all of you this week and hoping that you are well.
Good thought. Okay, well, if no one has anything else, we will close for the week.
Yeah, thanks and bye.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Have a good week.
Great. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.